Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming here in person at Goddard Space Flight Center and online to see the first Engage session of 2024 to celebrate PACE. So PACE is the Plankton, Aerosol, Cloud, Ocean Ecosystem Mission, and we are targeting February 2024 for the launch from the Kennedy Space Center in Florida. Here with me today, I have Dalia Kirschbaum, who is the director of our Earth Science Division here at Goddard, along with 4 of my very esteemed colleagues who are much smarter than I am and much more knowledgeable about PACE. So now I'm going to turn it over to Dalia to start the panel.
Thank you so much. It is my distinct honor and pleasure to be hosting this conversation with y'all today for this incredibly exciting mission where we are going to talk through some of the exciting discoveries, how we got here with the engineering. Now, at NASA, we are seeking to explore the unknown in the air, in space, and to innovate for the benefit of humanity and inspire through discovery. Now, we know that NASA studies all the planets, and in our quest for finding life around our galaxy, that includes our own planet. And so in Earth science, we have the largest collection of Earth scientists in the world that are seeking to uncover many of the vast questions we still have about how our Earth works, how things are connected. And that includes the discovery within our oceans and our atmospheres. So we know that over 2/3 of our land area is covered by ocean, and PACE is here to help with some of the key scientific questions in exploring our ocean, how it works, and the exchange with the atmosphere. Its measurements will enhance our understanding of crucial exchange of carbon dioxide between the ocean and the atmosphere, and at the same time, it will help to reveal how aerosols, these tiny particles in the air, and clouds control the sun's energy and how that's absorbed in the Earth in different states. So I am so pleased to introduce 4 members of the PACE team who have spent a long time in their careers to lead up to this point. First, we have Antonio Mannino, who's PACE's Deputy Project Scientist for Oceans. We have Inia Soto-Ramos, PACE's Data Manager and Validation Lead. We have Kirk Knobelspiesse, PACE Science Team Polarimeter Lead, and Craig Stevens, PACE Spacecraft Systems Lead. Now, just to kick us off, I'm going to invite our panelists to answer 3 questions. First is, how long have you been working on PACE? What do you do on PACE, and what are you most excited about? So, Antonio, you want to kick us off?
Certainly. So I've been working on PACE for 9 years now. I've been supporting the project scientist, Jeremy Waddell, throughout that time frame, keeping tabs on all the development of the instrument, the spacecraft. Also, I've been managing the, along with the PACE Applications Coordinators, the PACE Applications Program, which is one of the best that NASA's ever had, thanks to our wonderful coordinators. And also trying to advocate for the science that PACE will be accomplishing in the next 3 to 10 years.
And what are you most excited about?
Oh, the data, the science that we can do with this incredible series of instruments that will be coming forth from space in a few months.
Fantastic, and we're going to jump into that soon. Inia, please.
Yes, I have been at NASA Goddard at the PACE team for 5 years. I'm in charge of the data management from the field side, all the data that we can use from field collections and oceanographic measurements. Those measurements are gathered here at NASA, and we use them for validation, which is, I'm co-leading that effort and shepherding, making sure that the data that we get from PACE is excellent and good quality. And I'm really excited to see the first image.
Okay.
And I'm excited to see what we can do and how much we can learn about phytoplankton and how we can improve all the harmful algal blooms detection techniques. So I'm very excited to see that.
Wonderful. And we're going to get into some questions on harmful algal blooms because I actually have some. So, so we'll jump into that. Kirk.
Yes, I guess I've been on the project for about 8 years. I'm the polarimeter lead, so I work with the 2 polarimeter instruments on PACE. I guess we can talk about that in a moment. My background is mostly focusing on atmospheric science, aerosols, so particulate matter in the atmosphere, and clouds. And in terms of what I'm excited about, we have a list running of science and nature papers we're going to write right away after launch. And I'll be happy if we can do one of those.
Fantastic. Got to have the goals.
Yep.
All right, Craig.
So my name is Craig Stevens. I'm the spacecraft systems lead for the PACE spacecraft. I'm part of the mission systems engineering team. Gary Davis is our lead. So we're kind of the tip of the spear for the engineers. We we make sure that the system meets all the science objectives and manage lots of requirements and other fun stuff. I've been on PACE for over 7 years, and what I am most excited about, I'm excited about the first light, first science data. I'm also personally excited to see the solar array deploy after we separate from the vehicle and us flew to the sun, because then things are easier from there.
Fantastic. And we'll hopefully see that within 2 weeks. This is, we're in the countdown. Well, thank you so much. Again, we're really excited to have you here. So I'm going to kick into some questions that I'd like to ask you about. So first for Inia, you had mentioned about phytoplankton, which is the first word, plankton, in PACE's name, and how we study them from space. So could you talk a little bit about what is phytoplankton and how we study it from space, and how we differentiate the good phytoplankton from the bad for things like harmful algal blooms, things that can really impact people all over the world?
Sure. So phytoplanktons are microscopic plants. Think about, we have land plants, we have plants in the oceans. They're very tiny, and they have the same role as plants on Earth. Mm-hmm. They take carbon dioxide and sunlight to make their own food, and that food is the foundation of the base of the food web, right? So phytoplankton take that carbon from the atmosphere, make their food, and at the same time release oxygen into the water. So they play a very important role in the carbon cycle in the water, as well as climate change, as they're taking carbon from the atmosphere, utilizing that carbon for their own food. And eventually some of that carbons get transferred through the food web, for zooplankton, eventually fisheries and fish, and eventually us, because we eat the fishery, we're part of that food web. And some of that other carbon get exported all the way towards the depth of the ocean and gets sequestered there. Mm-hmm. So phytoplankton plays a big role on climate change and a big role on the ecosystem, because they're the base, the food web. Mm-hmm. Phytoplankton mainly are good. Most of them are good phytoplankton. They're very important for the ecosystem, but sometimes we have one or two that are a little bit of a troublemaker, that have toxins, and some of those toxins can be neurotoxic, paralytic shellfish, so they can be pretty bad. And when these phytoplankton grow in large concentrations, they can cause what we call harmful algal blooms. Mm-hmm. And these blooms can be very small or limited to a small area, but they can be very large and affect for example, all the West Florida shelf coast at the same time. And once that happens, usually the fishery gets affected. Shellfish need to be closed, because if fish ingest some of that toxic phytoplankton and humans eat it, they'll get sick. Mm-hmm. And the other consequences could be, another vector could be aerosols. If people smell some of the aerosol as the wave break out, they can get respiratory problem. And then we have the next vector is ingestion through waddling or playing in the water, right? Going to the water. So beaches need to be closed. So when there are harmful algal blooms, we need to make sure that we know where they are, and managers need to be able to either take decisions. Do we close the shellfish fisheries? Do we close the beach? And so it's really important for the public, and it's a public health issue. So we need to know to prevent illness in humans and pets and everyone that use the resources.
Absolutely. I mean, you highlight a really important link between our oceans, the behavior of our oceans, and how we feel it in our economies and our public health. So let's jump into a little bit about how we do that. So Antonio, from your perspective, the ocean color instrument, which is one of the instruments on PACE, how does that work? How will it help advance earth science and study some of the phytoplankton and other characterizations that we are looking to understand better?
Certainly. So ocean color instrument on the PACE observatory will be collecting the light coming from the Earth. That includes and what we call top of the atmosphere radiance. So that's all of the light. And basically, this is light that goes through a double transmission. It goes from the sun through the Earth's atmosphere, through the ocean surface into the ocean, and then gets scattered or absorbed and comes back out of the ocean through the atmosphere and up to the PACE satellite sensor. So and through that the sun's sunlight radiance becomes modified based on what's in the atmosphere and what's in the ocean and other aspects. So one of the key things that we have to do is remove the interference or everything but the ocean color. Basically, the signal that is solely the signal that's impacted by the constituents in the ocean and the water itself, absorbing and scattering properties.
And just kind of a follow-on question. So how do you see the ocean color instrument helping to advance our science in coming decades? Once it's launched, it's turned on, how will that specific instrument help us understand?
Yeah, thanks for that question. So current sensors and prior sensors only have 6 or 9 wavelengths or colors that they view in the visible and near infrared portions of the spectrum. The OCI instrument will have over 200. So that's a huge advance in our capabilities to study the ocean and the atmosphere, aerosols, clouds, and even land as well. So by being able to have that many wavelengths of information, we can better distinguish the different phytoplankton communities. The phytoplankton communities each are composed of different photosynthetic pigments. And the photosynthetic pigments absorb different wavelengths of light. And having information for those different wavelengths will help us better distinguish different phytoplankton communities, some of which are amenable to food web, moving up the food web for fisheries, and some are not quite as useful in terms of being promoted up the food web for fisheries. Either the zooplankton and the fish have their food preferences, and some phytoplankton are good food, and some phytoplankton are not, and then of course there's the harmful ones that Inia mentioned.
Yeah, excellent, and we're going to get back to a little bit more of that. But one of the exciting things about PACE is we've been talking a lot about the ocean, but also PACE is going to have a tremendous impact on better understanding our atmosphere. So Kirk, we know that PACE is going to look at different aspects of our atmosphere. Can you talk about what PACE will see and what instruments will enable that to happen?
Well, all 3 of the instruments on PACE will enable measurements of the atmosphere. And we should say that, the OCI instrument, the ocean color instrument on PACE, is designed to do ocean measurements, but we're not turning it off when we fly over land. So we'll be making measurements everywhere, and that includes measurements of aerosols, which are particulate matter in the atmosphere, and clouds everywhere on the planet. But there's also some utility that we're looking into in terms of understanding land surface reflectance. The 2 other instruments are multi-angle polarimeters, and I can talk about that class of instruments in a little bit if you like. The idea is that they're all maximizing the amount of information they can gather in the scene. So OCI is maximizing how much colors we can see. The other instruments, the multi-angle polarimeters, are sensitive to, they make observations at many different viewing angles, so they see the planet more than once from different geometries, and that contains information. They also see a feature of light called polarization. So not just how much light is there, but something about the direction in which the waves of light oscillate. All 3 of those pieces of information are very useful if we want to understand or create products from our observations. Aerosols are particularly challenging. NASA and other agencies have been making measurements of aerosols for decades now. And we're very good at understanding how much is present around the Earth and a little bit of information about what their nature is. But with the instruments that we will have on PACE, including the multi-angle polarimeters, we'll get a better understanding of aerosol optical properties, so we can trace those back to the various sources of the aerosols and the impacts that they have on climate.
So, I mean, I remember we were actually hosting a climate town hall the same day as the awful air quality event in
Yes.
DC caused by the Canadian wildfires, which were 1,000 miles away. So will the polarimeter instruments help us to kind of understand a little bit more about those air quality type issues?
Certainly. And that was unique for here in the Washington, D.C. area, but there are other parts of the world that have extreme aerosol events like that as well. And yes, aerosols have a big impact on climate, but they're also not great to breathe. And so if they're down at the surface, there can be an air quality impact of aerosols as well.
Sure. So we've heard about some of these instruments. There are 3 instruments on PACE, and that requires a lot of engineering know-how. And the PACE instruments were both developed here and with our partners, both here and internationally. But it's an engineering feat to put this together. So, Craig, could you talk a little bit about maybe the largest engineering challenge that you faced working with PACE, and kind of where you see, I don't know, yeah. Talk about that.
Good question. So, I mean, we faced several challenges. For those that don't know, PACE was built, the spacecraft was built in-house, as well as the OCI instrument. But from my perspective as the spacecraft systems lead, I kind of see about 3 challenges that we faced. I was thinking about this the other day as we get closer to launch. One is we did a trade early on to basically come up with our design to meet the requirement to tilt away from the sun 20 degrees in the southern hemisphere and 20 degrees in the northern hemisphere. And that minimizes glinting of these ocean color images. And that was a requirement given to us. So we did a trade and we decided to do something on the spacecraft side and tilt the entire 300 kilogram instrument. So that's something that I don't believe we've done in-house before, and had some unique challenges. One of those was, at the 20-degree positions, we need to have a very stiff, stable platform so we don't jitter or disturb the images. So that was something we worked through early on, and it worked out very well. There was another interesting kind of development work that we did called delay tolerant networking bundle protocol. This was kind of new to Goddard. We call it BP, but BP kind of changes the way we downlink our housekeeping files to the ground, and it turned out it was more efficient. We kind of demonstrated that throughout INT. Although it was new, it turned out to be something pretty novel and new to us and also beneficial to us. And then the last thing was to get the science data down. We did something a little different on PACE than we've done on our other missions. Instead of having a steerable high gain antenna that requires fine control and a gimbal to point at the ground stations, our folks in 560, Victor Marrero and that group came up with an earth coverage antenna concept. So as long as we're pointed down in the nadir attitude, we can close the link without having to maneuver any kind of antenna to any ground station in view. So it simplified our design and was also kind of new to Goddard. So to me, they were some of the biggest engineering challenges that we had to help meet these science requirements.
Fantastic. So I'm going to go off script a little bit. Heads up. So many of us in the Goddard community have worked on missions. They've worked on parts of missions, but understanding it from science concept phase all the way through to what we're hoping is a very successful launch in a couple weeks takes so many different people across the center, our industry partners, our academic partners. So I guess the question maybe to who's been on PACE the longest is what was the starting idea of PACE, and what should people expect as they're going to get really excited for launch? What should they expect in terms of PACE's journey through Goddard down to Kennedy Space Center, et cetera? So let's start with the initial ideas of kind of how PACE started. Anyone want to speak to that?
think
Yeah.
he's been here.
I don't know.
Well, I'll speak to it from the science perspective, and
Sure.
and maybe Craig can fill in on the engineering perspective. But
Yeah.
so I think the origin of PACE, or the concept of the ocean color instrument that is a main instrument on PACE, started in the early 2000s by colleagues that were here at the time, Chuck McLean and Mike Bernfeld. And they were, because we had such success with the CWIF's instrument in terms of providing climate quality ocean color, they conceived of the next generation. And of course, the next step was more spectral content, more wavelengths in order to better understand the ocean and separate phytoplankton communities. And so through many efforts, including engineering design studies, advocating it in the science, advocating it at NASA, that eventually led to the concept of ACE, and then the concept of PACE, and then there was a science team that was assembled to define the science and the requirement set that and then we finally got the approval for the budget to proceed with PACE in the end of 2014 timeframe.
Okay. So it's been a more than 2-decade effort, to say the least, from the science perspective. So how about some from the engineering? Kind of when did you start that process, 2014, to iterate on where we are now?
So yeah, I'm a relative newcomer compared to Antonio and some of the other science folks that have really pushed the mission. So I'm definitely grateful to them. I started in 2016, and the big push, as I recall, was this being an in-house mission. We really wanted to make sure we followed our cost and schedule. We had something called design to cost that we worked to. So I came on around the system requirements review phase, where we're really developing the requirements for the whole system there. So I think we really stuck to making sure that we both met those science objectives throughout. We did met those science objectives, as well as kind of maintained the spirit of that design to cost philosophy. We did trades along the way to balance that with science performance. One of the things I remember, we did a trade where we wanted, for the lunar cows, we wanted a really stable image of the moon as we swept OCI across it for their calibrations. And we had some MEMS gyros on our spacecraft, which are known to not be very accurate. So we did a trade, and we did end up getting another inertial reference unit to give us a much more stable image of the moon for these calibrations. So from my perspective, that's kind of what I'll take from this mission, is really kind of balancing both the programmatic side with meeting the science objectives, and I think we did okay.
Well, we're excited to see it launch. Yeah.
Can I add a little bit more about?
Please.
So the genesis of OCI was in the ocean color community, but as it developed, it became clear that it was important to also have speak to other disciplines as well. And atmospheric science and aerosols are particularly relevant to ocean color remote sensing, because one needs to account for their effects on light as the sunlight travels down through the atmosphere and then back up again. We call that atmospheric correction. I'm an atmospheric scientist, and I would say there's nothing wrong with the atmosphere, but that's why we were thinking that it would be good to have some sort of multi-angle polarimeter, which is a good instrument for that, and we went through several gyrations as to what that would look like, and in the end we have 2, so that's great.
And it speaks to one person's signals, another person's noise, and vice versa.
Exactly,
So
yeah.
it kind of speaks to that, how to maximize the signals. One of the things that is unique, I would say, at Goddard and for this instrument is the validation and making sure we check to get it right. Because you put something up in space, you kind of only have one shot. And so there's been a lot of work done in validating what data we expect to come down. Can you talk a little bit, Inia, about what do we need to validate PACE? What's gone into it, and what are some of the ongoing efforts to make sure that we get the data right?
Definitely. I think validation started with CWIF. During CWIF, we saw the need to really understand what we're seeing from space. So, right, you get an image, it looks beautiful, it has these patterns, but what is it?
Right.
That's a question, and to really understand what we're seeing, we need field data to compare and to develop algorithms. And that goes to like phytoplankton. We measure chlorophyll from space. That's one of our proxy to kind of look at phytoplankton. We need chlorophyll measurements from the field to compare with that. So CWIF was the pioneer mission, bringing all these ideas on all this stuff that we can do about ocean, just looking at this imagery, but are we certain of what we're seeing? There was those initial papers saying, look, this is a harmful algal bloom. Is it a bloom, or is it river discharge, or anything else in the water? Yeah. So the Ocean Ecology Lab started CBUS, which is the data in situ database for ocean optical measurements. And those are the measurements that are used to validate ocean color sensors, MODIS, VIIRS, CWIF, and it has the foundation to do PACE. So it's great that we already have that in place. So we're well prepared for validation. And this CBUS has been a long-term repository, so we have a good collection of data, and we have a great communication with the scientists out there, because they're the ones that go out there and collect the data for us. And so that has been building up for the past 10, 20 years. So we have a solid foundation on what type of data we need to actually validate PACE. And so from that perspective, we're going to continue collecting data. So NASA has funded few programs that will fund different scientists from around the world to go out there and collect data for us. For PACE, it's going to be really exciting, because for previous missions, we were looking at few wavelengths, right? So we were looking at the primary measurement for optics. How much was the water leaving radiance? What is the absorption? But now we're looking at phytoplankton. We have a full spectrum of colors. And we actually want to classify phytoplankton into groups, better detect them, and say this is a diatom, this is a dinoflagellate, this is a harmful algal bloom. So now we need a challenge. Our challenge is to start validating that type of data. That's the phytoplankton data that we're getting from the community. Back in the 90s, we were dealing with microscopic measurements. Now the field of measurements for phytoplankton have boomed in the past 10 years. So we have all these new instruments that take tons of imagery, and we're going to be starting getting some of that data. And our challenge, our mission is to make sure that we use that data to compare to what the satellite gets. And this is not trivial. It requires a lot of work, and it will be very exciting to see how good we can do in terms of detecting phytoplankton and how good the satellite is doing. So we have a plan in place. There are going to be 3 years of scientists collecting data for PACE, and the data is going to go through CBUS, and CBUS will create the matchup and the validation to make sure that we're getting the data that we need. And also, this data is going to use for algorithm development. In addition to validation, to detect phytoplankton, to classify them, we need to develop algorithms so that field data is used for that purpose as well.
So can you give me an idea of kind of what are some of the examples of the data, like where it's collected, what methods people use? One of the A in NASA's aeronautics, are we doing field campaigns? Are we going on ships? Have any of you had expertise going on one of those campaigns?
Oh, Antonio has a lot if you want to jump in.
Any crazy stories?
So we actually do have an in-house group that goes out to sea, collects water samples, and then we process the water samples and make measurements in the laboratory, including the phytoplankton pigments that you mentioned. We also collect the radiometry data, basically the light, spectral light field coming out of the ocean, and process those. The other optical properties, absorption and scattering. We can almost do it all. Not quite everything, but pretty close, at least on the ocean side. And obviously at Goddard, we also have airborne teams, teams that fly airplane instruments. And there's a a field campaign for PACE called PACE Packs that Kirk is leading, and I think you can fill everyone on that.
So PACE Packs, PAX is PAX, the Post-Launch Airborne Experiment.
Okay.
And as the name would suggest, it involves airplanes. And so we will be flying essentially airborne prototypes of PACE. On one plane, we'll be flying another plane. We'll have 2 planes. Another plane will involve in situ, point samples of aerosol and cloud properties. And we'll be attempting to coordinate observations of those 2 things with overflights of a ship, which will be making measurements like Antonio and Inia talked about. The idea is to have not just validation data that we compare to the satellite, but validation data of multiple things at once. So we fully characterize what's happening in that scene, both in the atmosphere and in the ocean, because our algorithms that we apply to PACE do the same thing. They need to account for all of these things together. So the general philosophy of PACE Packs, which will be in September, so about 9 months after launch, or 8 months after launch, is meant to help in that regard.
So you're telling me that we will potentially coordinate observations on ships, on airplanes, and on satellite all together?
And yes, and buoys and other autonomous platforms as well.
We should point out AeroNet, which is a Goddard activity. So field campaign is one time in place, and you learn about what's going on there. So it's important to tie this into measurements that are global and long-term. AeroNet, which is a network of robotic instruments that characterize aerosol properties at point locations around the Earth. So we'll be coordinating with that with PACE Packs, but we'll be making use of those measurements overall in validation of PACE.
And can you give us, where in the world are you planning these campaigns?
We'll be basing out of the home base of each of these aircraft. So we'll be in California. Armstrong, Flight Research Center for one of the aircraft. We're basing out of Monterey. It's a Navy postgraduate school aircraft. The ship will be based in Santa Barbara, but we can get them all to go in the same place.
But for PACE validation, there's a PACE validation team. Those are spread around the world, and they're going to use ship time from different parts of the world. So we have tried to make sure that the team is spread out, and we'll get measurement from almost every region.
Fantastic. All right, I'm just going to pause and say, for those that are listening online, you can put your questions in the chat feature, and we'll be able to take questions in just a few minutes, so encourage people to ask questions. So one of the things that we've talked about and hinted on is the human impact here. And I know that there's a really strong early adopters program, right? So these are people that are planning to use the data. But Antonio, could you talk a little bit about kind of the early adopters program and some of the work maybe with how we're understanding harmful algal blooms in the communities that could be affected?
Certainly. We started a few years ago, and we basically reached out to the community, both scientific and managers, to bring in those that are experienced with satellite remote sensing, whether it's ocean color or atmospheric products, to gauge their interest in PACE and how they would use PACE in terms of how they would apply the data. And so our coordinators have built up a very robust early adopter program, and there's, I think, nearly 30 early adopter groups. These include people from agencies or programs like NOAA, Coast Watch, for example, also NOAA Air Quality, also academic research scientists. There's a scientist at the University of South Florida who maps out the sargassum blooms in the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico. And so he's an early adopter, both in terms of sargassum, but also in terms of oil spill detection. And there's also those that are interested in harmful algal blooms as well. There are a few that are interested in looking at linking satellite data to viruses in waters, wildfires. Fisheries, looking at wildfires as well. So it's a pretty wide range of applications, including disasters as well.
Fantastic. And engaging with those communities help the data go further in to be used right away, which is one of the goals that NASA has to accelerate that science impact in those different communities.
Yes, so we're preparing them so we've provided those groups with simulated data. Actually, it's openly available to anyone, not just those groups, but they have access to those information. They know what the data files from PACE will look like, so they can start playing with them and making sure that their own code will be able to take PACE data and convert it to things that they want, whether it's a harmful algal bloom or whether they're looking at air quality products, and so that will be, or just use the actual products that are being produced from the project as well.
Okay, fantastic. So, so these are kind of the downstream users, pun intended, but let's go upstream to the people working on it. So the engineers and the scientists, are critical to making this get to where we are. So Craig, could you talk a little bit about what it was like and what maybe your favorite part was about working with the PACE engineering team?
That's a great question. So I don't know if people know, but there's hundreds of people that work on these projects just to get hardware, into space. So there's a really good team here that I've worked with for 7-ish years, I guess, of engineers, scientists, project managers. As systems engineers, we get to kind of interface with lots of different folks. So I think my favorite part is just working together with a team of interdisciplinary folks, both, on whiteboards, coming up with designs and design concepts at the early stages, working through the various problems, and then into the integration and test phase where we've got hundreds of folks just keeping things going, from IT people to engineers to test directors. We beat up the hardware pretty good to make sure it's going to work in space and meet all the requirements. So we run into a lot of problems, have to troubleshoot them along the way, and to me, that's the favorite part. That's my favorite part to working on PACE. It's the people.
Fantastic. Well, there's a follow-up question that just came in on the chat that is for you, and it is, I believe, from Luke. And what is the most insightful test during PACE integration and testing?
Insightful. So, excellent question, Luke. So I think that, in my opinion, the mother of all tests is our thermal vacuum test. So Goddard has a very large thermal vac chamber called the Space Environmental Simulator, I believe, the SES. So we're able to pull a vacuum on that down to essentially what's in space and put the entire observatory in there and run through all of the different tests, but we're testing all the different electrical paths, but we're also have a lot of simulations of what we're going to do during operations. So, and while we do that, we change the temperatures from one hot extreme to the cold extreme. So that to me, I think Gary Davis called it the mother of all tests. He's our MSE, and he's right. That's our best test of the hardware that we have. And it proved, I think, in my opinion, that we're ready to go.
Fantastic. Well, thank you. I have been standing next to the Space Environmental Simulator, and it is very large.
Yes.
So to be able to put a fully assembled spacecraft in there is pretty impressive. So for those on campus that haven't seen it, I recommend it. So let's look a little bit to the future, right? We are developing instruments and are launching them to tell us a lot about the Earth. And one of the things is about our atmosphere and about aerosols. And so I'm curious, Kirk, if you could talk a little bit about what you are looking forward to in terms of what we are going to learn, and then what maybe future gaps, what gaps we have now that this could provide some roadmap towards the future of understanding other parts of our atmosphere.
So I guess it comes back to the question of why do we care about aerosols? It's dust, right? How interesting is dust? It's actually all sorts of sources of aerosols. Some of them are human-caused, some of them are natural. Things like sea salt in the ocean or the smoke that we mentioned before, or other effects of combustion, human-caused aerosols. These all get involved with climate on the side of energy from the sun getting to Earth in the first place. So if you were to look at the Earth from space, we live on an ocean planet, but we also live on a very cloudy ocean planet. So about a third of the energy that comes from the sun is immediately reflected away, mostly because of bright things on the surface of the Earth, clouds. But how do clouds form? Clouds, it's actually, if you go to the microphysics of it, clouds, it's very hard for water vapor to turn into cloud droplets spontaneously on its own. They like to happen on something. So if you have particulate matter in the atmosphere, you make it easier for clouds to form. If you have different types of particles, you make different types of clouds form. And so that is really important for understanding the general distribution of clouds, precipitation patterns, and so on and so forth. It's what scientists call a highly nonlinear process. It's really dependent upon the type of aerosols there, on the meteorological conditions, and the type of cloud. And so if you're a climate modeler, one of the largest sources of uncertainty is how you parameterize that relationship. And so a lot of the source of that uncertainty is a lack of appropriate measurements. We've been pretty good for clouds and aerosols at detecting what things are, or where things are and how much are there. We've been less good at determining what exactly they are, and tracing them back to the sources, to the whole chemistry. I think we understand most of the processes, but trying to understand what dominates in one situation or another it's what's complicated. And so with the instruments that we will have on PACE, we'll be making long-term measurements of these things so we can start making global pictures of what's going on and try to understand just how that complicated relationship between aerosols, clouds, and climate, what we call radiative forcing, the energy balance of the Earth, how that all plays out.
And how does this set the stage for what could come next?
Oh, well, we haven't called out the polarimeters by name, and we should.
Please.
So there are two polarimeters. One is called HARP-2, Hyper-Angle Rainbow Polarimeter 2, and that's made by the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, just up the road from here.
And why rainbow?
Okay, I'll get to that in a second.
Okay.
But it's an instrument that looks at rainbows from clouds. If one were to look at the Earth with polarization-sensitive eyes, you would see rainbows everywhere, at least for liquid clouds. And you can look at those rainbows, and if you measure very accurately the position of the rainbow with respect to the sun and how it looks, you can understand the size distribution of the cloud droplets at the top of the cloud. And so that instrument, HARP-2, is designed to do that very well. The other instrument is called SPEX-1. This is an instrument from a consortium of organizations in the Netherlands. It's also multi-angle polarimeter, but it has very different characteristics. So HARP is sort of a wide field of view instrument. It has this ability to look at the clouds. SPEX-1 is a narrow field of view instrument, but it's also a spectrometer, like OCI. And so this will be a very, very good instrument for looking at aerosols. Okay. So the combination of the two will really help us disentangle some aspects of the aerosol cloud conundrum, in addition to helping our ocean measurements in terms of atmospheric correction. Okay,
and some of the missions right now are in formulation and development. Yes. So how can this help us advance what we're planning next?
Right. So the two polarimeters on PACE are really pathfinders. They're contributed instruments. And so what we learn about how those work will help future missions. I split my time on PACE with another mission that's in development much earlier in its life cycle called AOS, the Atmosphere Observing System. That will make use of a polarimeter. And we're still at the stage of figuring out what exactly that polarimeter should look like. So understanding from PACE how they're able to do what they do will help us design future missions in that regard.
And that's really a key theme with our engineering, with our science, is building on innovation to be able to innovate to the next thing. And that's really where NASA's sweet spot is. Yeah. So I want to invite people in the room if anybody has questions. I have a couple questions coming in online, but give opportunity. There's microphones on either side if you want to ask a question. All right. We'll take your question. Please,
Thank
if you could
you.
introduce yourself, that'd be great.
Hi, I'm Sherry Sokol. I work in the Customer Engagement Office in OCIO, and you guys are rock stars in my house. When my daughter came for Take Your Child to Work Day, she got to meet Pace Team, and she surfs and is so excited because the work you're doing is going to affect her in her life, and even though she's 12, she's like, wow, I see the connection. So thank you for everything you're doing.
Thank you.
We know, based on even the name, we're going to be learning so much information about so many different aspects of all of these elements. Big questions, small questions. And so I'm curious for you, what one question excites you the most to be able to learn from the data that we get back from PACE?
Fantastic question. Who would like to field that first? Don't be shy.
I think we're pausing because we have a lot of questions.
All right.
hard
The
to
first
pick
one that
one.
comes to your mind, Matt.
So I'm really interested in that hyperangle, the rainbow part. It's a measurement that hasn't been made the same way from space that much before. Once we do this, we'll be able to compare it to long-term records of other cloud properties that are made in a different way. And so it's a whole new way of looking at cloud properties. So I'm really looking forward to that, among many other things.
Yeah, I guess for me it's teasing apart the different phytoplankton communities that are present in anywhere in the ocean, whether it's Chesapeake Bay or the South Pacific or the North Atlantic, getting a better understanding of the proportions of the different communities that are present there, and being able to track that over the seasons and over the years to understand how this is changing. That would be one of many questions.
I agree with Antonio. I think looking at how phytoplankton is changing and how are its species changing around the world, or are there some particular species that are dominating, others that are evolving? Do we have more haves in the future? Are they increasing? Can we answer some of those type of questions? And also, I'm really keen on hoping that we can create some forecast system globally for harmful algal blooms.
And I know I'm not part of this chain, but I'm going to answer that question too, is that I think one of the exciting things is by taking these unique measurements, it helps us improve our models. And so one of the other things that we do in earth science or system science is connect our observations in models where we can't see the whole system at once. And so there's already work underway with the PACE team and with our modeling efforts, both at the Goddard Institute for Space Studies up in New York and the Global Modeling and Assimilation Office to connect, to take that data and figure out how we can use that in our models to better understand those connections between the surface, the oceans, the atmosphere. And so that is a really exciting, innovative piece of where we're going to be able to move as kind of a whole Earth system approach. So,
Thank you.
thank you so much for the question. All right, we have one more question in the room, and we'll take one online.
Hello. I think this Antonio's question for you, following up on some of the ocean color measurements. So obviously, we're going to have greatly improved resolution, but it does also continue, the record with CWIFs and MODIS and VIIRS and all that. So I'm just curious, are there long-term trends that you all are seeing in that existing data record that you're interested in continuing to monitor with PACE? And if so, sort of what's going on with the sort of global ocean color picture? Is it something that climate change is driving, or is it too early to tease that out?
Yeah, so that's a great question, of course. There are definitely trends that have been published based on the ocean color record. A couple. One as recently as this last year, and there's one that we're actually working on ourselves. And basically, we do see changes in the ocean color that we believe pertain to the community of phytoplankton that are present. What we call the least productive waters in the ocean, the central ocean gyres in the South Pacific, South Atlantic, and North and North Tropical and North Tropical Pacific. They're generally becoming more less productive, clearer waters, and that's shown by the changes in the remote sensing reflectance, or the ocean color. And then some areas like the temperate North Atlantic is becoming more productive, greener. Coastal waters in general becoming greener, meaning more production, more phytoplankton present. So those are some general trends that we are detecting, and that PACE will continue. But also PACE will one of the benefits of PACE is because it's just the ocean color instrument along with the polarimeters, just unparalleled data quality. The uncertainties that we expect are going to be far superior to what we have had in the past. And so I think that will reduce by reducing the uncertainties, we have better confidence in the longer term trend that PACE will continue and extend and improve.
Fantastic. Well, we have time for a couple more questions, and I kid you not, my mom just texted me one. Thanks, Mom. And will the phytoplankton differences influence the species of fish that will survive as we look forward? How do they influence fish species?
Well, fish like us decide what they want to eat, right? So if let's say there's harmful plankton, are you going to eat it? No, right? So I think the different type of species in the water will define the type of fisheries that we have in certain locations. And we have seen that fish aggregate some of these meanders and high productivity areas and regions. We have seen more fisheries in some places. Okay. So fish do decide what they kind of like to eat. So the variety of fish in the water will depend on what type of phytoplankton. And if there's those troublemaker phytoplankton, that would also affect greatly the fisheries all.
And so this really connects that knowledge to what could be fisheries in the ocean that people consume or industries as well.
Mm-hmm. That's a great question.
Fantastic. I have one more online and we'll get to the one in the room, but a question from Miriam about the potential use that PACE can have, or the data from PACE, to help address some of the gaps that we may experience when the Earth observing system, so the EOS instruments and satellites are going to be naturally going away. So we know that those observations are going to be phasing out over the next couple years because they've been up for over 2 decades. Are there any information from PACE that could help us understand or bridge some of those gaps in our understanding of the ocean or the atmosphere?
Certainly. You know, OCI in particular encompasses much of the capability of those previous missions. Not entirely, but much of it.
Right.
So one of the things that we're doing from launch is what we call heritage algorithms.
Okay.
So we're using a version of algorithms that have been used for aerosols on MODIS or VIIRS. We're also applying them on OCI. So we'll continue that record, but also hopefully fill in some of the gap that Miriam mentioned.
Fantastic. All right. One more question in the room.
Hi, everyone.
And we'll work to wrap it up.
I'm Jake Richmond. You know me well, but I have a sincere question I haven't asked any of you yet, and I want to start with Craig. So I'm fascinated by this dynamic that makes Goddard special, which is those conversations that happen very early in the development of a mission between scientists, in this case Jeremy Wardell and his project science team, and the engineers who have to listen to these ideas and then say things like, I don't know if that's doable, or could you maybe deal with this instead? I was just on a meeting with Jeremy earlier today where he was describing something you were talking about in this Engage session about the different angles of the instruments and how they have to rotate as they orbit, and how difficult of an engineering challenge that was. Ultimately, that was achieved, and that tends to be, the longer I'm here at Goddard, it tends to be something that we can talk about. Like, it seemed like something we maybe couldn't do, and then of course you and the engineers at Goddard tend to solve those problems, right? So what is that like in the early days when it's that push and pull, and then eventually now we're at this point where you're like, and yep, the instrument is there and we just need to get in space now?
That is a great question. I'll stick to that example. We worked very closely with Jeremy and members of his team when we were trying to determine how best to do tilting of OCI. Initially, actually, part of OCI, like the optical train, tilted, and it turned out to add too much complexity to the instrument. So we wanted to get that complexity out of there. But as we did that, now we have to tilt something bigger and bigger and bigger, so it takes longer. And that, when we're tilting, that affects, it basically takes science away from the science folks. So we want to do it as fast as possible. So we worked closely, to determine how fast, and kind of, there was a back and forth there as we did the trade. We were looking at tilting the whole spacecraft or just having a mechanism to tilt OCI and a couple of other crazy ideas. But, in the end, we worked very closely with them. I think that's a strength we have at Goddard personally, the science folks with engineering in the room, just whiteboarding these problems out and also able to go off and do studies quickly, whether it's back of the envelope or something more extensive. But we ended up kind of honing in on something that was achievable and leveraged us a lot of the other hardware we had on the observatory and was a good fit for us. So anyways, good question.
All right.
If I could add also,
Yes,
from
please.
the scientist perspective, it's
Yeah.
really great working with engineers so we understand what's within the realm of possibility.
That's right.
And sometimes there's a lot that's in the realm of possibility that we're not aware of, and we have to think, well, what would we do with that? That would be interesting. So that's also a pretty interesting part for me, too.
Yeah, as scientists, we try to push the envelope as much as possible. Like we try to get as much data, whether it's spectral, higher spatial, as much as we could. And the engineers accommodated us to the extent possible. And so it was wonderful working with all the engineers on the project. It was definitely fun and exciting, and also a learning experience at least for myself.
Likewise. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. It has been such a pleasure for you all to take your time to share what you're excited about, what we have to look forward to. Just a reminder that the launch will be at 1:30 in the morning from Kennedy Space Center in a couple weeks. There'll be live launch coverage, and there's so many engaging opportunities in their website to follow up. Thank you so much. We didn't get to all the questions, so we'll try to get an answer. And I also just want to remind everyone that we have these phenomenal scientists and engineers up here, but it takes a village, right? At NASA Goddard and in our community, to put together a mission like this, we need engineers, scientists, IT security, the financial officers, the cleaning staff, communication staff, international partner contributions, and the people to coordinate with them. We need safety and mission assurance. We need the launch facility. There's so many different pieces of what makes this successful. And so for anyone that's touched this mission or is interested in getting involved in a NASA mission, there's so many different ways to get involved. So thank you so much for your time. I hope you continue to follow PACE's progress, and go PACE. Thanks.